while generative AI is kind of new, it stems from disciplines that go deep and have real world context. So that's one thing. But the second real clue for generative AI to take it seriously is consumer driven adoption.
Yeah.
Now, not everyone is living in ChatGPT all day long, that's for sure. And folks like myself, for example, I haven't found a lot of really useful things with, I do have some AI tools that I use, but I really haven't, for me, it hasn't really changed my world.
Growing a business requires a holistic approach that extends beyond sales and marketing. This approach needs alignment among people, processes, and technologies. So if you're a business owner, operations, or finance leader looking to learn growth strategies from your peers and competitors, you're tuned into the right podcast. Welcome to the WBS Podcast, where scalable growth using business systems is our number one priority. Now, here is your host, Sam Gupta.
Hello, everyone. Welcome and happy Friday. And in this segment, we invite incredible guests from the community. And today we have one of the best, ERP folks in the community, John Reed. I'm pretty sure a lot of you already know him. So on that note, John, I don't know if you want to quickly introduce yourself and maybe talk about Diginomic as well.
Hey, Sam, it's nice to be in the hot seat with you. I know you're going to have some challenging questions for me, and hopefully the audience will too. So that's how we learn. It's always fun to be here. In fact, I was just arguing with you the other day around B2B versus B2C on CRM Convos. So it's great to see these conversations continue. In the context of the sort of ERP world, I've been writing about ERP market analysis in various ways since around the mid-90s. And have something of a roller coaster career but the constant was kind of looking at can ERP really deliver value for customers? Can kind of get into how it's fallen short, but also how it has delivered some value. So that's kind of one major. A big theme in my career was sort of building web communities, and I became really, really fascinated by how, and you probably find this interesting too, but how content creating important content for a niche audience can resonate with people and build relationships, and how those relationships turn into communities and how powerful that is. Look at us today, right? We got to know each other through our content first, and it's almost like we already know each other to some extent, and that's sort of a remarkable phenomenon. And interestingly enough, a lot of the software vendors in our space I don't think understand that dynamic as well. So that in the Diginomica context, that's one of the big things we set out to do. We wanted to, and Diginomica is about 11 years old now, but we wanted to basically take a different look at transformation in a real world context, and basically look at, what do the success stories really look like, including the hard parts and the challenging parts. Where do projects fall short and why, and how do they become successful? And so that's sort of at the core of what we do. So in some sense, we're not futurists. In some sense, we're trying to put the buzzwords to the test, right? That's at the core of our sort of thinking and methodology of how does this really work? Does this hold up to use case scrutiny? And of course, different technologies hold up better than others. And, so over the years, we've seen some that, I think overall, I think SaaS has provided some enduring value, though we can question some of those things too. Whereas something like blockchain, got excited about it for a while, but really couldn't detect a lot of the valid use cases, right? And there are still a couple of characteristics of that technology that could work in some limited cases, but as a tool, it becomes more of a small tool, not a change the world tool. So we're trying to help customers make sense of all this and make sense of the noise. And then finally, I guess what I would say is that overall those years with Diginomica, where we kind of straddle the fence between an analyst sensibility and a media sensibility, we upset a lot of apple carts in terms of wait, who are you? You're not Gartner, but you're not a media company either. Who the hell are you? And
exactly.
So we have those conversations, but over the years, what I did is I developed, maybe 10 or 12 different fairly unique ways of evaluating the enterprise that I sometimes call them Johnisms because they're somewhat unique to my point of view, but other people do share some of them.
Yeah.
But I'm starting to think maybe, preparing for your show, I started to think maybe I should try to combine them all into one book or something. But one that I did put out was on reaching the informed buyer, because that's really at the core, I think, of what we're trying to do, but maybe also what you're trying to do and what a lot of firms are trying to do, which is to break through the viral noise and really reach the decision makers and the people that matter with much more targeted, thoughtful approaches that aren't about mass marketing, but really are about connecting with us and connecting with decision makers. And so we have a whole method behind how we do that. So that's basically Diginomica. And then the final piece of the puzzle is AI. And a few years ago, I decided that AI was not a passing trend, but a very serious thing that we were all going to have to contend with across work culture in the future. And so in the past 3 years, I've dedicated myself to going deeper into AI than anyone else on the circuit. Now, granted, I'm not saying that I succeeded. That was just a goal for me.
Yep.
And in fact, the more I learn, the more I realize how much I have to learn. But I think it's really, really important to dive deep on that, because if you don't, you can't really decipher vendor announcements and what they mean. So anyway, so those are the main themes.
Yeah, so there are many layers that we can probably touch on here. So obviously, one thing that you really like to talk about is buzzwords and hype train. And when you look at technologies such as your blockchain and AI, I mean, there is a huge contrast in this, right? If you look at the consulting community, they sort of want to go after every single buzzword. That's with vendors as well. Hey, as soon as the buzzword comes, okay, let's throw in somewhere in the marketing, and hopefully that is going to resonate with some people, I guess. I don't know if that is the approach that they take, but that is the sense that you get when you review any sort of podcast marketing material, from these vendors, and the consultants are probably going to have very similar flavor as well. So when you talk about the hype, how do you decide, or how do you come to the conclusion that AI is going to have more impact? For example, let's say if we talk about impact on the ERP community, ERP and blockchain is not going to have that. So how did you come up to that conclusion? I guess maybe describe your thought process.
That's a really great question. So first of all, one thing we didn't talk about is that we're primarily large enterprise focused and some mid-market as well. And so we're looking at how projects work in the real world in larger company settings. And so that creates some criteria on its own. So for example, like part of the evaluation of something like blockchain is it secure enough for large enterprise settings? Is it performant enough? Does it scale? And one of the biggest problems that got exposed in blockchain was that performance and scale were really, really core issues, right? And so when you look at AI, for example, AI clearly doesn't have those problems, right?
Yeah.
Scale is not an issue. I mean, look at what NVIDIA is up to, and and all the hyperscalers and stuff like that. Like there are some questions in terms of the desire to scale data even further. And you and I and your analysts gone, wow, we got into with that game, we got into quantum, and can quantum help scale it further? So there are some of that, but the point is some of the boxes get checked just around things like performance and scale. But also AI as a discipline goes back a long time. And while generative AI is relatively new in a commercial setting, it stems from deep learning, which stems from machine learning, and that's been around for quite some time. And when you look at it, that has made some progress in various contexts for quite a long time. And there's a bunch of businesses even in the .com economy that gradually became more and more algorithmically driven. I would argue often for worse more than for better, right?
Yeah.
But for example, the Facebook was a classic example of building a business that became increasingly algorithmic. And while that's not you could argue, is that really AI? And we can talk about that. But the point is, it fits somewhere in that umbrella, right? And so a lot of those technologies started to prove themselves at scale. I mean, look at recommendation engines, right?
Yeah.
Like that is a form of artificial. Look at things like facial recognition. You can already see the broad scale adoption of a lot of these technologies. GPS on our phones, for example. Now, there are different considerations with generative AI that really need a very hard look. But the point is that a lot of these flavors of AI have been successful. And while robotics in the physical sense does have a lot of limitation, at the same time, within those limitations, it's had a profound impact on factories and logistics. And so you can see that in real world settings. So number one, while generative AI is kind of new, it stems from disciplines that go deep and have real world context. So that's one thing. But the second real clue for generative AI to take it seriously is consumer-driven adoption.
Yeah.
Now, not everyone is living in ChatGPT all day long, that's for sure. And folks like myself, for example, I haven't found a lot of really useful things with. I do have some AI tools that I use, but I really haven't. For me, it hasn't really changed my world. But I have colleagues who use these tools sometimes. But in general, a lot of people have used them, right? And when you have phenomenon where your kids come in and say, I wrote this school paper with this, can I, and you're as a parent, you're like, what the hell? Or as a school administrator, you're like, what do we do? When that kind of stuff happens, that's a big clue that the enterprise is going to change too, because that was the same thing with mobile technology and to a similar thing with the internet as well. So I pay a lot of attention to that. And and with blockchain was really more, okay, it had a very niche, broad but niche use case around crypto, but that was really it. And then metaverse, of course, was more like the Web3 stuff. Felt very much like some Silicon Valley people that got really excited about what consumers would like without really thinking through what that means. So anyway, those are the kinds of criteria that kind of come up where you want to put it to the real world test with customers, but you also want to look really hard at what's impacting people in their lives and are they using technology? And it turns out people are using a lot of flavors of AI.
Yeah, could not agree more. And I really appreciate the sense of realism, I guess, you bring to the table, from the technology commentary perspective. That's what I am a big fan of. So let's go back to your article, I guess, and it was a very interesting article. And guys, if you have not checked, you must check. And I think we are going to link that here as well. So John, and I am a big fan of your articles as well. Okay. They start with the core point. And here in this article, the core point was, is ERP still relevant? So now, where do you stand on that? I know that, there are going to be at least 10,000 different definitions of ERP today. So what's ERP, I guess, and is that still relevant? So let's start with that.
Yeah. So, I called the piece sort of extracting value from ERP in a customer-first world. And then the AI component becomes more important too around, is it relevant as AI evolves too? And these are really important questions. And, the thing that was really notable about the ERP market is that it ultimately had more potential than it delivered in a lot of senses. Like so, for example, like in the 90s, I started writing about this, what I called extending the enterprise. I even had a newsletter called Extending the Enterprise. And my dream was that we need more outside-in perspective that ties into these systems. And at the time, I just didn't feel like internal transactional systems were enough to really move the needle on how you serve customers, how you change your business model, how you manage your supply chain. It didn't feel like it was going to be enough. But where I got exposed back then is the technology wasn't really there to do that. So you could talk about that all you wanted, but tying all of that and connecting all those dots wasn't realistic at that point in time. And then you had a bunch of shifts, but over time you had the rise of so-called cloud ERP, which does look like it delivers a better value proposition in a lot of cases than traditional ERP, but it's not the only way forward. And when you look at companies today, they have very pressing issues. And one of the issues is they do need to articulate some kind of AI strategy just because they get too much pressure from their board. Like there's a kind of a don't be left out of the AI thing. So they do have to have that, but they also at the same time need to be able to say, how do we become more effective in our industry in a volatile and challenging macro environment? How do we do that? And what's the next step in that? And so a lot of times right now you say, well, we need a much more iterative approach to value, right? So if we're going to commit to a project, we need to be able to show our people a month in, here's the value we're already deriving and build on it. So you could call it an iterative approach in a way. You can have a long-term project still, but if you can't show steps along the way where you're delivering something, that you're going to struggle because you never know what shakeup's going to happen inside your company. No one has a tolerance for a 3-year ERP migration more, right? But the reality is that ERP can still be relevant. It's just, it may not be where every company wants to go because now so much of it is about data and building business models off of data and building new services off of that data. And you might choose to quote unquote ring fence your ERP, so treat it as a back office data repository and focus more on, say, building customer apps or self-service apps or some kind of AI application or smart embed some of that in your products. There's so many things you might want to do. And so I would say, yes, ERP, in a nutshell, ERP is still relevant, but it's not the only way forward. I do think that companies make a little bit of a mistake, though, thinking that an older ring fence system and pulling data out of it is fine for the long term. In the long term, if you could snap your fingers and put costs aside and all that aside, you'd be stupid if you didn't want to have a real-time enterprise where all of your applications were running in a real-time way, where you had visibility into transactions and data. If you could tell me who wouldn't do that if they could snap their fingers and do it, versus like ring fencing an old back office system. They would absolutely say, snap my fingers and do it. The problem is you can't. You can't snap your fingers, so you have to make choices, and some of those choices are tough.
Yeah, so very interesting conversation. So snapping the fingers, I guess, from the AI's perspective, and again, I think I'll go back to my demo of Epicor Prism, and I don't know if you were able to watch that video, but now when it comes to extracting the insight from the back office systems, it does seem like the way agents are going to work and the new interfacing with the ERP systems, it's going to be like snapping the fingers. So now, based on this context, do you see the, I guess, the value of ERP changing, or maybe the positioning of ERP changing, that ERP would become more of the backend function? And I think that's what Satya, Nadella, he has been talking about, that the transactional applications are.
Well, with all due respect to Nadella, who's a pretty brilliant person, he's just wrong about this. And I understand why he wants to get people excited about this. But to understand this, Sam, we may have to go into a little bit of technical discussion, okay? But this is a really, really important point. If you so think about agentic in a few different. There's agentic in something of an advisory way, which is like, give me some information, like, and interact with the system and get some useful stuff to do my job better. It might be search, it might be market analysis. But a lot of times the way we're using agents is in this autonomous sense, that we think agents are going to essentially do a bunch of stuff on our behalf, right? So we might say, so for example, onboard this employee, or maybe the agent would do it themselves. But when you peel back the technology, the agents we're talking about today, and AI agents don't have to be this way, but most AI agents, when you and I use a term, are connected to an LLM planning agent. So the first step in the chain is an LLM planner. And the cool thing about that, and the reason why people are getting excited, is that LLM planner has some level of quote unquote reasoning capability. So the AI agent is charged with a particular thing, and a lot of times it'll be very focused. It might be like accounts payable recognition, right? Like it'll be charged with a very specific task. Identify the fields on the system that might be missing from the transaction. But the thing is, Sam, that the agent is not going to always pick the correct tool. And that's we're talking about a probabilistic tech. LLMs are probabilistic. They're not deterministic. So the suspense with agents is that they're going to pick from a range of tools, and they might pick a data tool, like to bring in customer data, or they might want to execute an action like a workflow. But a lot of vendors, and Nadella, I would put into this based on those remarks, but it was just like one conversation. They're implying that the agent can go into the system and complete transactions. The agent can't do that. Like, now you could provide some permissions and allow it to do it, but would you really trust it to do it? And so a lot of times what the agent's going to do in that case is it's going to invoke a workflow. So for example, you look at UiPath is an interesting vendor in that regard. They're not the only one, so I don't want to hype a particular vendor, but I'm just saying for the talking points, what they've done a lot of robotics process automation. So they view those workflow automations as being invoked by agents. So in other words, the RPA is a deterministic technology. If it does the same thing every time, it's just not very smart.
Yep.
But if you tell it to do something, it will do it, right? And so the idea, which I think they're on the right track here, is that the external agent invokes a more reliable workflow to do that part of the workflow. But the agent still is the planning agent is not foolproof. And so this whole idea that the enterprise is going to be run by agents, frankly, is ridiculous. But what the agent really needs is it needs an automated system that it can invoke workflows from, and that are reliable and trustworthy. And so you can't just back office that, Sam. It's not just a data repository. It's a workflow engine.
Yeah.
ERP is a workflow engine. You can't just say, oh, the agent can do that. The agent can call out that system, but you really don't want that agent running those transactions right now. I talked to an agentic ERP vendor the other day about this because they were using the term autonomous agents. And I said, are you implying that you would actually have that agent go conduct these and they're like, oh, no, that's not what we mean at all. And I said, well, what you're really talking about then is a quality assurance agent.
Yeah.
And that's really interesting because the concept behind that is that these agents are going to monitor all these processes and then flag issues. And the issues are going to get brought to the attention of people that matter, or in some cases they might execute a script based on that within certain parameters. But the quality assurance is really interesting, and because, as you know, Sam, like, we lose a lot of stuff. Like these projects are very detailed and elaborate, and having smart machines analyze our workflows and pick out gaps and weaknesses, that's really smart. And so there's a huge role for AI agents, but I think there's still going to be a huge argument for modernizing your ERP system into a collection of workflows that can be invoked. Now, over time, will that evolve into less of a coherent transactional software system and more a library of workflows that can be I'll buy that.
Yeah.
I'll absolutely buy that. But this is where I get so frustrated with the AI conversation. LLMs cannot be changed from their probabilistic roots. That's what they do. Chain of thought, reasoning, all that stuff, it gets you closer, but it doesn't change. The technology was built that way, and everything else is a Band-Aid.
Yeah, could not agree more. So let's do a little buzzword test here. I guess that's your favorite topic always, right? So let's talk about cloud, and obviously we'll talk about AI agents as well. So overall, when you look at cloud, is that a buzzword? And from the beginning, we have been talking about fake cloud. I don't know if you use that term or not. I don't know how fake the cloud is at this point of time. Some systems are not necessarily fully cloud native, but they are all claiming everybody's cloud. Everybody's fully AI compliant. So where do you stand in terms of the maturity of cloud ERP? Do you think when we look at every single cloud ERP vendor, are they created equal? Are they different? So what's your position on that, I guess?
Wow. Okay, that's a great question. And look, it's a tough one because everyone wants to like rank vendors and say, oh, this vendor is better than this one. I believe, and I think this applies to AI as well, that the future of enterprise software applications is very vertical and very industry specific. And I think built for industry is the way forward. So think about it historically, Sam, where ERP systems were, except for the manufacturing ones, were much more generic around like, okay, general ledger, maybe HR, maybe you have, maybe in some cases some CRM, but basically applies to all these different situations. And then alongside it might be what I call the green screen industry system, and I kind of make fun of them. That's not very nice. But like, so for example, a restaurant management system. I remember earlier in my career, I worked at a furniture store, and it had this ridiculous green screen inventory system. Well, and that ran alongside the accounting software.
Yeah.
And that was a lot of how ERP lived for so long. And even with cloud ERP, that was still the case. And I would argue that that version of cloud ERP that isn't overhauling and modernizing your industry systems is out of date. Like, if you put in that kind of cloud ERP, you're not going to derive the value you need in the world of AI. Like, I used to tour manufacturers when I worked a lot with manufacturing software, and I'll probably do more of that in the future. And I was always fascinated that going into plants, the most expensive and mission-critical machines were often very old. They were a beast to maintain, and their data wasn't connected to the ERP. Yeah. Like it was separate. It was on some MES system, some legacy MES system. You can't have that anymore. That's part of the impact of this sort of AI thrives on a real world data set. And you need these systems to be combined. So in the end, that's the big change I think that needs to happen. But did cloud ERP provide more value over on-premise ERP? I would say as a general statement, yes. And we could get into a lot of the specifics of that, but it has to do with everything around, so for example, economies of scale for the vendor, delivering new features faster and more effectively to customers, which was always a bugaboo with old school ERP. Much better user experience, mobile access. You could argue whether it's always a great thing to be approving purchase orders when you're watching your kids like soccer game, but the point is there's that more like flexible way of working kind of thing. A lot of companies wouldn't have got through the pandemic, for example, without a cloud ERP system. So you can kind of see why it's a more resilient architecture, and also it forces people a little closer to standard. Although I would argue that I've written about this, that it's not as vanilla as you think, but part of it is like part of the whole cloud ERP thing is forcing people to think a little bit harder about why would you customize your accounts payable process? That's not where you differentiate. Like why wouldn't you use more out of the box software for those things and then differentiate in other areas that are more specific to your business? So that's kind of the
Yeah. So one of the comments that you made is, the whole industry notion that the future of ERP or any other business software categories are going to be slightly more verticalized. And overall, when you look at the state of the industry at this point of time from the vendor's perspective, they take two different approaches. One is slightly more platform oriented because they want to make sure that their resellers and the main distribution channel is able to make some money. Because if they don't, who's going to sell, I guess? So that's one approach. The second approach is the verticalized approach. Now, it's always debatable which is going to be more successful. You create far more impact when you take platform. You take any major enterprise software companies in the industry that are really successful, meaning they are able to penetrate the enterprise market. Even if you talk about the companies such as your Snowflake, Databricks right now, Salesforce, very platform-centric approach, even though, sure, you can call them CRM vendor, but the reason why they are so powerful is because they are sort of enabling this ecosystem and they are creating jobs for people. That's the major power for these vendors. So industry approach versus the platform approach. What's your take on that, I guess?
Ultimately, I kind of would push for both. I know you want me to choose, so I don't want to sneak out of the question. And by the way, hi to the people in the chat. Jason, you have a couple questions we should get to, but so on this front, like one of the dynamics that was really difficult is that in the early 2000s, there was this whole best of breed surge of like, oh, I want the best software in every area. And that got really discredited because of the difficulty of integrating different solutions. And then I think we really have evolved towards the best way to go about it is choosing a platform. And when you talk about like a vendor that has built out a platform, in my view, they haven't just built a platform. They built a whole community around it.
Exactly.
So they built an ecosystem of applications. Like, to use a non-enterprise example to avoid a shout out to a client or a non-client, look at Apple, right? Like, and how the iOS adoption is so much about the robust apps around that platform. In an enterprise context, the beauty of that is being able to extend your cloud applications with various kinds, like you said. In many cases, that would be some industry-specific functionality that the vendor might not have at that point that you need, or some kind of differentiating capability. You really want both. And I think that one of the phrases that you talked about, buzzwords, one of the phrases that I have banned usage of, not for everyone at Diginon, but for me, is seamless integration is not allowed, because that's bullshit. And I've heard that phrase used a few times in the last couple weeks by different vendors. Just stop it, okay? Just stop it. I'll start using that phrase. You know when I will use it? When customers start using it. That's when I'll start using it. In all of my career, I've heard one customer use that phrase about a project one time. And granted, it did catch my attention, and it was a cloud-based scenario with two cloud products that not only had APIs that were robust, but they had an integration agreement of sorts, not point-to-point, but protocol-based stuff, business logic, all of that. I heard the word seamless. I heard it one time. And I don't think there's any coincidence that it was a cloud-to-cloud application scenario. What customers want these days, I think, Sam, is I think they want to standardize on a platform with vendors that they trust. And probably there's a few of them, right? Because there's not one platform that provides all of your enterprise software. But they're going to standardize on one or two or three platforms of vendors they trust. And they're going to want interoperability. So it's not a best of breed, but they do want to pick occasionally different areas they can plug in and they don't want to have problems with it. But they do understand that they're increasing the integration burden every time they do that. And I don't care. You can't solve that. That's not solvable. There's an integration issue every time you do that.
Yeah, could not agree more. So let's go over some comments and let's say hello to these guys. So I guess Dennis
Yeah,
is there.
hi everyone. Jason, you had a couple of zingers we'll get to here, I think.
Yeah. So Jason has ring fencing ERPs fine. This was the question related to your comment, I guess. But be sure it's modernized and optimized.
So Jason, by the way, Jason, always great comments in the chat. Yep. I disagree, Jason, with that statement, but part of it could be that you and I are using ring fencing differently. But when I use the term, it's basically, for example, when like CX vendors come in to a customer, they'll tell them to ring fence their ERP systems and focus on customer. Why would they do that? I don't know. Yeah. Maybe they're trying to sell some CX software. When they use the word ring fence, Jason, they're not talking about keeping that system modernized. They're talking about pulling data out of it. Yeah. And so it's very difficult to keep a system modernized and ring fence at the same time. Now, there are a couple of ERP third-party maintenance providers that are making some progress on keeping systems a little more modern while supporting them, but it's not easy to do because you're no longer, at that point when you ring fence, part of that understanding is you're no longer really working hard to upgrade those systems and absorb the latest functionality. So I think that's the problem, Jason, is that it's very hard to modernize it, and that's why these are tough choices. And so the whole point is that when you choose to ring fence anything, you have to accept the downside of that arrangement as well as the upside.
Yeah, could not agree more. Great comments. So we have some more. We have Silvano. Hello,
Silvano.
For joining, and then Jason again. So Jason is saying John is on it. Where will your business support probabilistic versus deterministic outcomes, and how will you complement those probabilistic outcomes?
Jason, I think this is really interesting because someone's going to get exposed this year, either me or some vendors, and that's going to be fascinating because there are vendors that are implying that these agents can execute autonomous transactions, and yet I go onto social channels and I'll watch developers say I told this agent, to order me a pizza and it delivered it to the wrong location and it billed the wrong credit card and all of that stuff. So I think it's going to be really interesting. The probabilistic part, Jason's actually easier because the probabilistic fits into all kinds of predictive scenarios and all kinds of scenarios where you're advising people. And then there's a whole conversation we could have around, there's a lot of really cool stuff that's happening around optimizing architectures to make them better, and not just probabilistic, but more informed. So, for example, I'm about to issue a whole thing on RAG evaluation agents and all this thing around basically like RAG is about like pulling its context from your customer specific data into those AI decision-making scenarios. And so you get more and more accurate and you're like, well, so for example, one of the reasons why first-party support is a really attractive use case is that, look, you don't always have to be 100% accurate in first-party support to get the job done for, especially if you design it well where you could escalate to a human if you need it. I've had a couple of pretty good agentic support resolutions on, but that's partially because you can have a little bit of an accuracy tolerance there. So it's not just probabilistic. It's what areas of your business have an accuracy tolerance, and that also depends on your industry and your compliance and stuff like that, right? So for example, financial services firms are much more wary about first-party agentic support where they have more scrutiny, and the same will be true of like medical. Yep. Whereas for a lot of other things like tech gadgets and stuff, go for it. I just had a friend email me about T-Mobile where they were offering like agentic AI support for free, and then you had to pay $5 to talk to a human. And my friend's wife ended up with an agentic AI support, and it didn't understand her plan that she was on. And so that got all screwed up, and she talked to a human, and the human had to refund her because the AI didn't know her situation. So welcome to so a lot of businesses are going to press ahead with this, but I think a lot of it is looking at the probabilistic part is hard. The hard part is not hard. I'm sorry. The hard part's the deterministic part, which is when can we trust these agents to actually complete transactions for us? And that will be really, really interesting because then you're pulling humans out of loops, so to speak. So we could talk about use cases the rest of the hour in terms of which ones are more promising and which ones aren't. But first-party support's an interesting one. Invoice recognition. A lot of redundant manual administrative stuff is interesting. But again, a lot of that may work better in conjunction with more conventional forms, invoking more conventional workflows like RPA as well.
Okay, perfect. So we have some more. So Charles, thank you so much for
Hi,
joining.
Charles.
We have one more comment from Jason as well. So Jason is saying, what are the modern ingredients for an organization achieve ERP value, particularly in this period of transition from on-prem to SaaS-based ERP? I think that's, I guess, 2010. Now we are talking about SaaS to AI-based ERP. With this
Yeah.
evolution, is it easier or more difficult for organizations to deliver value?
Well, that's really interesting. And Jason, you may want to scour the article. You may have read it already because I can't cover all the points in it. But one of the things I do when I do use cases with customers at shows and on meetings online, one of my first questions is always, how did your ERP project help you to serve your customers better? And I think that's a core question you have to ask now, because if you can't satisfactorily answer that, then I probably don't like your ERP project very much. But when you look at really successful cloud ERP installations, one of the things you hear about a lot, for example, is, oh, it was so much easier for us to acquire new companies because we could quickly put them on the new system, and that we could never do that before. And it might not just be customers. I'm using customers more as like stakeholders. So it could be it helps you manage your suppliers better, or it could be even that it helps your employees accomplish more if you have a franchise setup and they're making better decisions on the ground because they're able to analyze. Because one of the big things about getting this right is now you can probably slice and dice your data better based on location and based on which products and services are profitable and all of that stuff. So, Jason, what I would say is that the ceiling is higher in terms of what you can achieve with SaaS-based ERP, and it's probably more affordable, like the consulting ratios are probably in general more affordable, but you can get in the same kind of trouble with the products don't get necessarily that much easier. You still have the same things, which is how does this support your overall transformation that you're trying to do in your industry? How are you going to compete better? And how does your ERP investment stack up against other stuff? And finally, Sam's AI point is really good, which is I do think some customers are going to choose to sit this out for a little while and see what emerges with AI-driven ERP, because you might say, well, what if we choose this vendor, but I just heard Satya Nadella say that ERP software is going away. And we already talked about why I don't agree with that, but that could still influence a customer. Or a customer could say, actually, I think there might be a startup that emerges in a couple years that's going to be better. So I do think it's going to create a little bit of market stagnation as customers try to make sense of how is software changing, because there's so much hype out there about that right now. So it's a very interesting time.
Yeah, it is a very interesting time. So we have one more comment from Jason, and there are going to be some layers that I want to hit on, and hopefully you can address those, John. So here, Jason is saying industry plus platform. Okay, so this is a very interesting argument that I want both. I want platform capabilities plus I want the industry capability.
Yep.
Where it becomes interesting is when you are going to have third-party vendors, because then you have different legal obligations. So the question is going to be, okay, so yes, you have the platform, but who is going to provide the industry capabilities? Is it going to come from the OEM or is it going to come from the third-party vendors? Again, because of the politics as well as power struggle, and those are bigger challenges than any technology out there, in ERP or any sort of digital transformation.
No, I think you're really right. And I think that's one of the reasons why firms like yours or mine can sometimes be valuable, or any advisory firm that isn't attached to a project that can help people make sense of these politics, because politics is like part of the challenge here. Like, how are you going to manage these different vendor relationships? And what I said in the last show you were on, I think you were in the hot seat, but I said, like, ultimately we need to emerge into a world where customers, vendors, and service providers agree upon what success looks like and how they're going to measure. And you push back a little bit on that in terms of KPIs, because there are some limitations to what you can measure and how to do it. But the point is, the customer needs to take some ownership of that and figure out which vendors are going to sign on to that, and more importantly, how is it going to be monitored. And one of my big disappointments about AI in general is that most vendors haven't harnessed AI to help monitor these projects and figure out where they go awry, because there's a lot of early warning signs, I think, and they can be detected in things like both system usage but also employee sentiment and stuff like that. But you're totally right, and politics is like a big part of this, and I do think that's one reason why people are going to stick with a handful of application platforms as their main ones, because it's not quite one throat to choke in the historical sense of that, but it's close, right? So if I'm having some broken integrations or some issues, I want to be able to go back to a couple of main vendors that I'm invested in and say, I need you to help me fix this, right? Because you said this third party would integrate with this. But one final point is that then you have a very sort of organization specific question on to what extent do you have IT resources, and to what extent do you view building intellectual property and smart devices and stuff like that as part of your core value proposition or not? And if you do, you might choose to build some of those industry components yourself or to co-innovate with a third party. But some of this comes down to your individual IT philosophy as an organization, because there are companies that are more trying to still outsource a lot of that and be more consume cloud software and not really have their own software development teams, and that affects your decisions on how to differentiate.
Yeah, so it's very interesting. So let's talk about the politics a little bit more, I guess. And you talk about aligning these different parties, you have different vendors, and maybe we can come up with some KPIs that everybody is going to follow in some capacity. But that's not how the real world works, because everybody has their own sort of agenda. They are all competing for the same revenue, I guess. They are fighting their own battle. So when you put 5 people in the room, or 5 vendors, or 5 stakeholders in the room, things become very, 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 very different in my personal experience. So let's say, and I don't know whether you are going to address this more from the vendor perspective or more from the customer perspective, but how would you address this challenge?
Well, like I said, I think you have to start with the customer, and you actually have to step back a little bit and say, the first set of advice you really need is how effectively are we competing in our industry right now, and how are we going to compete in our industry 5 years, and what are the blockers and what are the challenges for us, and how are we going to succeed? And I think you need to have that conversation independently of your vendor commitments and your technology commitments and everything like that. And you need to be able to talk about, how is AI going to impact this? How is our serving customers going to evolve? Are we going to, for example, remain only B2B? Are we going to do we envision some direct-to-consumer models coming into play? You really have to understand who you're trying to serve. And that includes your core suppliers, all of your external stakeholders. You need to understand that first. And then you start thinking about which are the trusted vendors that we want to align ourselves with first and foremost. So my only objection to the scenario you described about 5 people sitting in a room is, if you do this right, you might have 5 vendors in that room, but there should be 1 or 2 that you're really saying, these are our main go-to vendors. And the other people in the room need to play nice with these vendors, or they have to leave the room, Sam. Yep. You can't just have a collective. That's the whole reason Best of Breed didn't work. And I would challenge you a little bit, because I do know a couple vendors that are further along this path where they show customers, here's what the value you can expect from our implementation, and here's how we're going to monitor it. Now, I will agree with you that most vendors don't have that yet, but some are making progress on this point, and not to my satisfaction. And I have a whole thing, a piece on attention vendors. You don't have customer success until you've done these things, and the things are almost, the degree of difficulty is intentionally really high, because I want to expose the whole customer success conversation. But the point is, some vendors have made some progress on how we're going to monitor and track this. And so essentially the customer and their chosen platform vendor, and this would probably be an industry platform. So in one case, I'm thinking about an industry ERP/asset intelligence vendor that can do some of this stuff. And so they'll meet with the customer and they'll agree upon this long-term roadmap of how they're going to deliver value. And then the customer will select a partner that's trusted by all parties, and they'll have these conversations and agree. Now, to your point, okay, we may need to bring other vendors into the mix, but they're coming into the mix as guests. They're invited guests. If they don't sign on to these suppositions and agree to interoperate with the main platform, they're out. Because to your point, if you allow a room of 5 vendors having equal voice, that's chaos. Now look, I'm not saying this is easy. I'm not saying this is easy at all. But what I am saying is that customers need a clear understanding of how they're going to compete, how their platform commitments and vendor commitments help them compete, how they're going to measure the value of that, and then what are the technology and processes in place to monitor that. Because the way the projects go awry in this world more than any other way is they go on too long down the wrong path before someone finally finds an indicator that isn't right and says, wait, something might be wrong here. Why aren't we doing that in real time? Like, we do this for our personal health. We have I don't personally, but a lot of my friends do. They have they're monitoring their all these levels, these glucose levels all day long. Why aren't we measuring our project's glucose levels every day? Like, where's the AI for that? Like, there's AI for everything else. Why aren't vendors making AI for this? I don't understand.
Yeah, AI is going to have real value for that, for monitoring, I guess, and that's where we are going to see some agents. So that's probably consistent with your comment related to AI. Now, let's go back to there are 2 or 3 different layers. I guess they are sort of interconnected. And this is related to your point, the whole consulting ratio comment on cloud ERP. So one layer is the whole seamless integration that you had called out, that, seamless integration, there is nothing called seamless integration. Okay, you have to put in a lot of work for it to be even closely seamless, I guess. You are never going to get there. But again, you have to put a lot of work. Now that requires a lot of planning, expertise, consulting. And when you look at the whole cloud model is very constraining, the way cloud is designed. So now that requires a lot more expertise overall to plan around that, because you are going to hit into a lot more constraints. In the on-prem world, that wasn't the case because the model was far more fluid. You could do pretty much whatever you want. So you didn't have the same legal, political, licensing, and the vendor constraints. In cloud, that is different. So now this requires a lot more consulting expertise. But you are arguing in your article that in the cloud world, the consulting ratio is not going to be as much, which is true, I guess. You probably don't require as much, consulting. So where do you sort of stand in this? That, okay, cloud would require a lot more planning. You probably don't require as many consultants, but you definitely need expertise, I guess, right?
Yeah, you nailed it. Look, it's a fact that consulting ratios have gone down in most SaaS implementations versus on-prem, and it's not hard to understand why, Sam. Heavily customized on-premise systems are just harder to upgrade and manage. Now, some companies might view their customized system as a competitive advantage, and we can have that conversation. I'm biased because I think that customizations rapidly fall out of date, and I think most customizations that are supposedly competitive are really more about accommodating user preferences for, I want my icon over here and stuff like that, versus true. But you could make the argument that we've customized our system and we're going to deal with the downside. What I get frustrated with is that we don't have honest conversations about what the pros and cons of these situations are. And you're absolutely right that reducing consulting costs as an obsession can be deeply problematic as well. Because consulting is not just a commodity cost to control. It's about the future of how things evolve. In the early ERP days, one of the reasons why we failed to deliver value, and by the way, the history of the ERP world is about under-delivering value versus what companies pay. One of the reasons we didn't is because ERP consultants were hopping from project to project. They were going from oil and gas to retail to whatever and configuring systems. What the hell? Every one of those industries has very specific expectations. And ultimately, that's why I believe that the future of all of this is industry specific. And one of the fascinating things about AI in that regard is that a lot of the AI plays are much more about, let's transform everything. And I think where we're going to see real movement in the enterprise is when people sit down and say, how are we going to transform retail with AI? Or how are we going to transform a certain kind of asset intensive manufacturing with AI, and really focus on a discrete set of problems instead of trying to boil the friggin' universe every time we build a technical solution. But to your point, you're going to need people who can come in. What is more important to a company than someone who can come in and say, my team can configure your ERP system at a good cost, but more importantly, what I'm going to tell you is which of your competitors are exceeding you in certain areas in how they're approaching the market and which ones aren't. And what are your biggest weak points and how are you going to fix them? And hey, by the way, the customization that you want to pay me a bunch of money to do, that's the wrong one. Like the app you want me to build, that's not the right one. That's what a true expert consultant does. They don't just take the welcome wagon of everything a customer wants to do. They push back and say, actually, you should be doing this instead. And one of the things I welcome the most about the modern environment is we're getting away from these massive one-off projects and into these ongoing, quote-unquote, customer success scenarios where my job is to support your customer health long-term. And if you can't look at our consulting relationship and see how I'm doing that, bye-bye.
Yeah, exactly. Great point. So now let's go back to, and you had a lot of layers in this conversation, and I think you had this comment in your article as well. Right?
Oh, by the way, Dan has a kick-ass question, so let's get to that before. I mean, you can do it in a few minutes, but just make sure you get to it before we close.
We'll definitely get to that.
Okay.
So what I was talking about, this whole notion of what do you call implementation? When do you call it finish, I guess? The vendors are always going to have a little bit of conflict. And I think that's always going to be there because, obviously from their perspective, they are trying to justify the value that if you are going to be on my system, then you are probably going to get faster value. And there is nothing fundamentally wrong about that in my mind. But from the customer's perspective, it's slightly different. And I think that's what you have argued in your article as well, that, this is not said and done. You have to invest continuously. So now, do you hold vendor accountable for that? Because, they are calling something implementation, but that's not the real definition of implementation because you have to still invest afterwards. So what's your position on that, I guess?
Yeah. So just to review a few quick things from the piece, my takeaway quote from the whole piece is, extracting full value from cloud ERP is not about flipping the go live switch. It requires organizational will on the part of the customer, obviously, and what I call a fierce collaboration with the vendor and consulting partner. So that is not a typical type of salesy language, right? Yeah. And what I'm trying to poke holes in this piece is I talk about how SaaS ERP does bring better user experiences, a simplified systems landscape, more affordable deployments, and frictionless consumption of new functionality. Of course, we can use the word friction with a little bit of quotes there because it's not always easy to absorb the new functionality. But basically, that's where a lot of vendors position their use cases. And I'm like, are you kidding me? Okay, that's nice to get off of 57 QuickBooks systems. I totally get that. But that's just the beginning of value. And so in the piece, I talk about the phases of value achievement and extraction, and that's just the first, which is immediate gains by consolidating disparate systems on a user-friendly platform, including compliance and security. So that is a benefit. But the really important ones are the next ones, which are, number 2 is increased decision support and benefits of data visibility in near real time via a so-called single source of truth. And then the third is achieving new business opportunities to a more agile and open platform. And ultimately what we're trying to do, if we do this right, is flip the switch a little bit from 80% administrative work and 20% customer facing and strategic to the other way around. That's the whole goal. We want to be 80% customer focused and strategic and relationship, whatever humans are still good at that machines aren't doing, and then only the 20% on the admin. And we're not even close to that yet. And if you just relax after go live, you're nowhere near achieving that. And that responsibility falls on all parties, Sam. It falls on the vendor, it falls on the services partner, and absolutely it falls on the customer. And again, I push customers. I'm like, look at these advanced use cases and how some of your peers are doing, because you're not doing that. You're not pushing for that. And vendors usually have a fair amount of this stuff available, but they don't always aggressively help customers do it. And when you talk with them, they have consternation about that for the reasons we described, because if you're not achieving that maximum value from your vendor, you might just take a phone call from an AI agent ERP, right? So
I would love to take that phone call.
Yeah,
I'm dying
exactly.
for that.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's go to Dan's question. Hey, Dan, thanks for joining. So Dan is saying,
Dan, what's up?
With really good vertical industry solutions in the market and iPaaS is probably a thing of the past. Now we should be talking about AI PaaS. API tools available to feed data like GL to data lake. Is one ERP policy even relevant anymore?
Great question, Dan, but I'm going to take issue with the premise. But it is absolutely the question the customer should be asking, so I'm not surprised that you would ask it. So we have to separate this into 2 components of perceived value. One is workflow automation and let's call it intelligent workflow automation, just to concede something to AI there. And then it's better informed decision making. Your question assumes that the only value is better informed decision making. And in that case, yes, you can pull data from a variety of places into a so-called data lake. Now, the one problem with that is that sometimes you lose some of the business context, which is why certain vendors have been announcing, if you will follow the press lately, big new data solutions that are about helping customers make more sense of this data more easily than just sitting in a data lake. Honestly, powering AI with a data lake isn't always the best approach. And so, yes, to some extent, you're right. But on the analytics side, if your goal was only analytics, maybe that would work. But from a workflow automation and transactional, frictionless transaction thing of end-to-end things from your end customer all the way to product delivery, what you're describing doesn't work. These silos of industries and ERP and stuff, I railed against that earlier. That doesn't work anymore. You can't get rid of workflow automation just because you can make intelligent decisions on your analytics. You need both, and that's why I wouldn't say it's a one ERP policy. I would say that customers are going to want to combine industry and ERP into kind of a new software system. Some of these ERP vendors don't even want to call it ERP anymore because it's different, but it's about how you create an intelligent operational system for your industry that then informs your decision making.
Okay, so we have one more question from Jason, and Jason is saying, in terms of value extraction, do you expect composable and microservices? And now we are talking about composable
Jason's
again.
got the buzzwords.
ERP to make a broad-based play in the next 5 to 10 years. And I don't know, John, whether you have reviewed my comments, and I had a little back and forth with Phil, overall on composable on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
So
are you a fan, Sam?
Of composable?
Yeah.
Well, so composable has a place, as I would always say. Microservices, they have a place. Composable and microservices, they are not AI. Let's not compare them. That's my personal position. And again, don't try to make every single app composable. That's not how it is supposed to work. So that would be my position.
Yeah. So look, I think, Jason, that's a little like the buzzword bingo is fun there for me. And I do ultimately like the vision of that. It's just that sometimes it introduces complexity as well. And those are the trade-offs. It's a different kind of complexity. But if we do fast forward, Sam, like in a visionary way and look ahead like 10 years, I do kind of like the idea that you would interact with a so-called intelligent intermediary that would basically choose from a library of workflows that might get more and more like discrete, might get more and more individual, like little pieces, because that's better for security and troubleshooting and everything else if you can kind of assemble these building blocks together in new patterns and stuff like that. But I would say that's a very, very gradual thing. And I think you have to look at this very, very carefully and figure out where do you need that kind of interoperability and where can you kind of live without it, because that kind of composable stuff, vendors have talked it up more than they've delivered on it.
Yeah, so we are close to our time, but Dan has a very interesting comment, so I want to make sure that we are covering that before we close. So Dan, he's saying, this is fantastic, guys. I believe that the future is industry specific as well, and I feel that the generic AI and AI agent use cases should be different per industry. To date, they have been focused on CX, CRM, HRM, the white collar scenarios, and not much in manufacturing and MES. Do you see more AI use cases coming in IoT and machine, the blue collar areas?
So Sam, I think Epicor might take issue with Dan's comments.
Yep.
Coming back to the demo that you got all excited about. Dan, I think one of the reasons for that is not because people don't understand the industry plays, but for two reasons. One is that a lot of these white collar sort of co-pilot scenarios, they're kind of the so-called low-hanging fruit to start to build trust in AI services in areas that are a little more quote unquote harmless. Once you move deeper into your mission critical manufacturing process and stuff, the kind of criteria we talked about earlier over reliability and probability and stuff like that, the expectations for that go much higher. But also these broader plays are what people get excited about because they please investors and they please Wall Street. But in the long run, yes, I do believe that those with intimate knowledge of industry are going to build really interesting adopting AI capabilities into that industry. And to some extent, that's already happening. We haven't even talked about shop floor robotics and stuff like that, but a lot of the customers, Dan, you're referring to, have already advanced into a fair amount of shop floor robotics and intelligent automation on the shop floor already. So we have to be careful not to think that that's not happening, because it is. The new part is the generative AI stuff and how that factors into the mix. But and agentic AI as well. But there's a lot of stuff already happening. But you're absolutely right, Dan. I think that is happening. And if you look at the ERP vendors that focus on industries, they're all talking about this right now. Now, when we peel under the hood, are they delivering on that for customers yet? It's probably a little bit early. And that brings us back, Sam, to the beginning of our conversation and why it's so important to go out and document those early use cases and learn about exactly what's working, what's not, what the trade-offs are. And we're not quite ready to have those conversations, but I hope in a year's time we will.
Yep, perfect. So, John, I know that we are close to our time, so you are going to have any sort of closing advice. And, I think people already know who John is, but let's say if they want to find, what is the easiest way? I don't know if you're going to respond.
Diginomic is fine. Hit me up on LinkedIn if you want to chat. I didn't know what to expect exactly, because this was our first longer show, and I've enjoyed the Analyst Gone Wild segment. But your questions were awesome. You really pushed me, which I think is why I think this kind of show is so valuable. And I guess that's kind of my advice to everyone here, is that we have to push each other right now to deliver value for customers. And so that's why these kind of conversations are so important, like the audience as well, pushing us. That's what it's all about right now, because no one has all the answers right now. And we need to find a way of delivering value while also recognizing there are open questions, because both are possible. And the one thing I get frustrated with is vendors rolling out so much agentic stuff, they're implying that they're not delivering anything of value now, and that's not true. A lot of these vendors are delivering some really great stuff now, and so we need to balance the two. Let's help customers solve some problems, and then let's also help them make sense of where this technology is headed. And if we can do those two things, we might actually have jobs in a few years, Sam.
Exactly. We need a lot of them, right?
We might need a few.
Awesome, John. Thank you so much for your time and insight today. This has been incredible.
Cool. See you next time.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the WBS Podcast. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcasting platform so you never miss an episode. For more information on growth strategies for SMBs using ERP and digital transformation, check out our community at WBS.rocks. We'll see you next time.